When individual bodies have the autonomy to choose lower quality education and justify it, they are more likely to do it. This is for a couple of reasons. Whether it's the lack of expertise because they don't have a dedicated ministry and therefore they don't have the access to experts in research. Whether it's because of the level of bureaucracy which often exists at this particular level. Whether it's the idea of local governments having more competing interests because of the fragility of their position when you aren't successfully part of a ministry. Whether it's because of economically these local governments tend to focus more on typically more cash first motivated, giving things like cash handouts, donations, or emergency aid. These local governments historically only implement, not devise policies in and of themselves. We say that this division of power should stay in this particular manner. Second problem that I want to posit is the idea that these poorer states are often underfunded. These are people who have a poor generation of profit in and of themselves and are dependent on the central government to continue funding them through the policies in which the government wishes to be successful in those particular states, meaning that often their avenue to getting this sort of funding is having these new policies implemented in these poorer states. The path to victories for OG there are two paths to victories for OG. First, that the quality of education will just simply be better in our world. But second, that poorer areas are just more likely to get education funding in our world. I'm going to start with illustrations for both sides. What does our world on site opening government look like? We believe in the controlled model. This means it will be done by a central body, whether it's the Board of Education or the Ministry of Education. What's important for you to note is that this will be a dedicated body at a federal level. These are people with access to the widest level of expertise, but on top of that have for decades been implementing, studying, devising and revising education policies, including teacher qualifications. These are people who make budget distribution decisions for the entire country when it comes to things such as what we're going to do, for teaching institutions or teacher institutions. And these are also the people with simply the widest capacity and access to resource whenever you're talking about education. What does opposition then need to defend? It looks like the flexible model. We say that it's likely states are probably going to get similar or maybe even equal, probably similar funding under this particular model, and they will have the freedom to devise exactly what sort of policies they want to go through. If, say, opposition wants to counter this and say, no, there's going to be different funding, we say the approval process in order to get different funding is one which is probably going to be incredibly bureaucratic and, in other words, slow. Before I continue, I'll take a POI from closing. Opening?
Do you think Betty DeVos, the head of the Ministry of Education in the US, is particularly competent or an expert in education?
Typically no, but that's just one person, right? The reality is the entire board is comprised of a multitude of people. The people who make syllabuses for both teachers and students are often multiple experts from a wide variety of institutions. On top of those who are democratically elected, there are sufficient checks and balances within this particular system, particularly because it has been such a long-running system compared to something which you are trying to make, which is new, having these local governments do it. First argument then, why states will always channel this money elsewhere, or in other words, simply will not be able to get better teachers. I think that one, it's just a lack of a dedicated body which exists in these particular areas. There is no part of a local government, whether it's like states in Malaysia or states in the US, who have spent the past few decades trying to devise, revise, and make these particular policies in order to improve the quality of teachers in these particular areas. But second, these local governments often have competing interests, meaning that they often focus on having more lower quality teachers because this is the short-term benefit. And there's a very particular analysis that I want to bring up here. The fact that the fragility of a local government's election is way more than that of a federal governments, because the idea is that there are less people voting here. The margin of difference or the ability to get a majority is a lot more difficult in these local governments. They are often not swayed by most politicians rely on the credibility of their past experiences in parliament, given that you are an individual who are not necessarily in parliament yet or has never been in a ministry yet. It is incredibly difficult to secure this particular job. What does this mean? It means that you are more likely to focus on these short-term, within your term policies in order to further secure that power. But third, the capacity for you to treat these teachers well or treat these teachers well is incredibly low, especially in these rural areas, which means the ability for these rural areas to use their policies to attract people to become teachers is incredibly low. What are the impacts then? I think that one, the likelihood of you getting a high quality level of teaching qualifications is incredibly low, meaning that the capacity for these people to devise a teaching qualification plan which will produce good teachers is incredibly low. But second, I just think the likelihood of the money being used in the most, not innocent in the most effective or the most efficient way is incredibly low because of those short-term interests that these particular politicians have. It's unlikely they're going to focus on the sustainability of a quality education in the way that I'm about to prove to you we get in our one. Second argument, why is it that our particular model has the better capacity to facilitate quality? I think that one, it's just on manpower and resources, right? The idea that these particular boards of education have spent decades, are built upon decades of research, of decades of policy. And I want to note, this is not just your MPs. It is also the variety of researchers and lecturers and teachers, and we have this thing called excellent teacher in Malaysia, which is the best teachers in Malaysia. It's these types of people who will be part of this board of education, all coming together in order to find the best particular teaching qualification program. But second, this is just a dedicated body in and of itself. The idea that you have manpower dedicated to it, that has always been dedicated to it, is something which is beneficial because it's unlikely that you're going to have the competing interests in terms of where your focus should be in the way that a local government would. But third, it is in direct conversation with these other ministries, which means that you are not limited in that expertise to just education. You already have this access. You do not have to fight or pay for it. You are able to speak to these other ministries. It is likely you're probably, for example, you would talk to the Ministry of Economy and you would know why a particular subject or particular teaching qualification is needed, and you're more likely to fight on the metrics of quality long term because of its importance to all these other ministries. Fourth reason is that you are, is the fact that you overview the entire country. The federal government and the Board of Education within it have the incentive for this policy to be done well because of the democratic nature of the federal government. And as a result, because they overview the entire country, we feel it is more likely that they will channel these funds into these poorer areas to make sure that they are able to provide the capacity to these particular areas in order to implement these policies well. The impact is clear. These poorer areas are likely to get better funding. But second, the quality of teachers is just so much better. And I want you to weigh this on the fact that education has evolved. Children have evolved. The attention span of people is terrible right now. And COVID completely changed the ability for these children to adapt. We say it is time for us to become more rigid, more strict in these teaching qualifications in order to ensure these children can actually benefit. Thank you.
Now calling on Leader of Opposition. Here.
The realities and needs of children coming from rural areas and big cities are extremely different. National educational boards are usually not capable, and even if they are very capable, they simply have no way to accommodate to all these different needs by using the same standardized way of evaluating and training teachers. The framing here is that I think local authorities and schools or local educational boards also have perfect incentive and capability to do hiring and training very well. First, in terms of incentive, number one, they want good reputation and they want to avoid educational scandals, which is why they have the incentive to do fact check. For example, their teachers have not been ex-cons or have not committed such suspicious behaviors before. And number two, I think they also have the incentive to actually do the hiring process very well because they care about their enrollment rate of the school. They care about the university attending rate in their, for example, local area. These are important because number one, this could determine how much funding they receive from the Central Educational Bureau. And number two, local people also care about the quality of education a lot because children are usually the most important issue for people. And number three, local development also largely depends on how many people can actually go to school, go to university, and come back to contribute to these local areas. Therefore, we think that local authorities do have an incentive to do this well. They also have capacity because there are experienced teachers who are in the educational board who actually understand what the local situations are like. Two arguments. Number one, on our side of the house, why do we get more teachers? The status quo is that in rural areas, there are usually not enough teachers. However, the central government sets the bar of becoming a teacher extremely high. The restriction is very strict, and the training programs that you need to undergo before, for example, going to the exam of becoming a teacher is very long and expensive. There are a couple of reasons why this happens. Number one, the experts and bureaucrats who design these exams of teachers and those training programs are often the ones in the cities, meaning that they have been educated, for example, in the West, they are accustomed to realities in the city and they haven't been to rural areas, they don't know what the situation is like, they are simply unaware of local context. Number two, even if they know that in rural areas the situation is pretty bad, they want to cater to the average student in the entire country, which means that at the end of the day, the bar is still likely to be high, at least much higher than the ones in rural areas. Number three, I think it's also because teaching is largely glorified under the social narratives, meaning that these officials want to make the test even more difficult so that people feel that teacher is a respectable job and people feel even better and more respect towards the educational bureau. And number four, I think it also looks like a lot of rich urban schools will try to lobby for stricter restriction on teachers, since this way they can get higher quality of teachers who have undergone better training and stricter exams. And lastly, I also think there's institutional inertia because of all of those reasons, the high bar has already been set and there's not an incentive for these institutions to suddenly to reform and cater to students in the village. So this creates the reality that there are not enough teachers in rural areas, because for the teachers who have passed the national exam, they have spent such a high cost on training for these exams, for example, like preparing for these exams, and the cost is so high that they're simply unwilling to go to a poor area because they have gone through so much trouble and their goal is to stay in big schools in the city. And number two, there's also a political incentive for the central government to send these teachers to local areas, because in these rather poorer regions with lower educational qualities, this is also the regions that are less politically important, because the voter turnout rate of poorer regions often turn out to be very low, since these people, for example, are occupied by their work, they have no time to vote, they have no they have no awareness that voting is very important, so usually they're the voter bases that are discarded and are not deemed as important by the central government. Sorry, later. So what happens on our side of the house in the flexible model? I think more teachers are likely to go to rural areas because number one, they will realize that rural areas have their own, like for example, exam or bar exam of becoming a teacher, meaning that when you go to these areas, you will actually have less competition. So if you're, for example, less capable than your classmates, you might just go to like rural areas to seek employment there. And number two, because of the cost of training is much lower, you're also like happy to become a teacher there because you feel like you haven't sacrificed so much time and energy and money in becoming a teacher itself. This means that on our side of the house, you have more teachers in rural areas. And note that this is extremely important because more teachers means that teachers are not overworked. They can have more attention to students. It means that students are going to learn more from the teachers, since they like the teachers do teach better and they have more energy devoted towards teaching. And also students are more likely to stay in school because when they indeed have some issues, teachers actually have the energy to care for them and ask for them what happened, instead of just saying that I have so many students, I work so much all day, I don't have the time to care. So this means that on our side of the house, situations for rural students get significantly better. Yes, closing?
Obviously, the state doesn't want to waste massive amounts of money, so they're going to encourage a lot of teachers to opt in by like giving them higher wages at the end because they have control over these things, right?
I think these things just take up higher cost, and since these like local areas are not that politically important for them, they won't waste the money on that. Second argument on why quality of education also increases on our side of the house, I think the first reason is correlated to our first argument, since now we see that teachers are actually voluntarily going to rural schools because they have less competition there, instead of being forced to go to these schools after, for example, they cannot seek an employment in a big job. This way, we see that on our side of the house, the teachers who go into rural schools at the end of the day do have empathy towards children, since it's their voluntary choice to be there. However, in the comparative, when teachers are forced to go to there, they feel resentment towards the school. They feel like it's unfair that they end up in this trash school after they have studied so much for the teacher exam, after they have spent so much money and time on training, meaning that they're likely to feel resentment towards the children and not likely to teach them very well. Second mechanism here, we think they also get better training in terms of specific needs. And this doesn't just go for rural schools. This also applies to schools in bigger cities. This looks like, for example, the training programs in city center schools in rural areas are going to be very different. In large metropolitans, for example, the training is going to focus on how to keep talented children engaged. How do you teach a like very talented student base who might not be satisfied with what they're learning inside the curriculum? And I think teachers who will go to these city center schools are likely to be the ones, for example, who are simply smarter. They don't have to be very good at teaching, but they definitely are smart enough to keep the talented children engaged at school. And the ones that rural area training will emphasize is, for example, how to explain the basics. Insofar as in many of these rural areas, maybe middle school students only start to learn the simple ABCs, it's very important that number one, teachers are prepared to face this reality. Notice that in the status quo under the central system, they are not even prepared for this because everyone taught them in the training program how to teach students important things such as English debating. But when they go to rural school and realize that students there don't even know the ABCs, they are unaccustomed to such reality and they simply don't know what to do. And second of all, I think on our side of the house, they're also more able to teach the students since for example, it's very hard for you to actually explain the basics. You do need a lot of training to realize how to, for example, dissect a very complicated idea into something simple that local students can actually understand. We think that this can only be achieved on our side of the house since we have specific training programs tailored to different types of teachers going to different areas. So at the end of the day, we're the only ones that can provide rural students and city students with better education. That's why I'm so proud to oppose.
Okay, previous speaker for the speech. Now calling on Deputy Prime Minister Julienne.
When you lend the authority for the state governments to decide about the quality of the education, it's likely they will probably skimp out. It's likely these people will pick unqualified teachers because of two reasons. Either A, they just have competing interests. What Atifa explained to you was that a lot of these local governments care about other things because these are reasons why they're probably going to get the vote better. If you build a mosque, you will probably get the vote better. It is probably not these intangible things that you usually can't quantify. That is to say, the quality of education which will allow these individuals to get votes. This is basically the WEDC quarterfinals 2023 debate. But B, these people just don't have the capacity to do so. So maybe if money was a wash, what Atifa argued was because of the initial contingency that these people probably wouldn't channel as much funds to it. Even if they did have the same amount of money, the likelihood that they would be able to engage in the same kind of quality of research, in the same kind of, say, construction of these policies in order to allow for the best facilitation of education becomes a lot more worse because there's literally no Ministry of Education which exists on the ground in most of these individual states. So it may be true they have the incentive to do so. We argue that that's probably going to be untrue. There was very little engagement which came out of OO to explain why that's probably going to be untrue from what Atifa explained. They wouldn't be able to actually do these things. They don't have research centers. Maybe they have individuals who are relatively passionate about trying to educate individuals on the ground, but these are not people who can turn all of these incentives and as well as passion into actual material policies which allow for these individuals to change these individuals' qualities of life, qualities of education. What Atifa argued to you on the comparative was that these federal governments have A, the greater capacity to actually do these things, which means we actually have literally the Board of Education comprising of a lot of different individuals from diverse backgrounds. So if their case in OO was really just local circumstances, I'm unclear why that's not a benefit we can also get on our side of the world. When this board is not literally full of just 10 people, it looks like a council full of hundreds of people. The trade-off, if it is bureaucracy, is the benefit of these local circumstances on OO side of the world. But the benefit there is we're able to channel this energy in a lot more of an effective manner, which means we can actually make policies which are structured around the long term, allowing for individuals a path to actually good education in a standardized way. So we just have a greater capacity to do these things, far more than what the comparative argued, which at best would just be a mitigating factor. But B, that we literally have an incentive to do so. We don't open them up to the incentive to use these monies. These local authorities, even if you didn't want to buy that they were corrupted, which arguably is very, very charitable because there's very little oversight over how this money is moved around at these local levels, would mean that these individuals just wouldn't spend on these things. They would probably spend on a lot of other incentives, as I've explained, like religious infrastructure. On the comparative, which we argue, these people have an allocated budget. That allocated budget has to be used on education, and that's the reason why we just can't funnel it elsewhere. It's a very, very low burden. It is a relatively sure mechanism. It has worked in the past and it will continue to work. When you deviate from this, the standard changes and things go to shit. But before that, closing.
Yeah, so central governments also have several incentives to fund things like religion or defense or other things. So like local authorities can also allocate budget before they start the financial year. So why isn't it incentive on certain?
So if it was a broad incentive at a federal level, the inequality wouldn't be as bad because everyone would be getting the shorter end of the stick. If it was up to the state authorities, there will be some states with relatively good education. On your side of the world, it will be the most religious states, the most red states who will probably be deviating from that, and the people who will be vulnerable or suffering of it will be the children. The standardized discrimination is better than the unequal discrimination which exists on their side of the world. Two things I want to engage with from the OO case, probably a reason why CG can like kind of come into this debate, right? First is that the bar is way too high, and this is like such generic material, right? We just think this is untrue. A, education is just relatively accessible. Like education on educating teachers is just relatively accessible. So it's true, you can literally go to community colleges to learn about how to be a relatively good teacher. These are not things which require hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of student loans in order to get it. In Malaysia, by the way, it's literally funded by the actual federal government. So it really doesn't require that much money. You can opt into becoming a teacher, a relatively high quality teacher, which means the concession on their side gets a lot worse of a quality of teacher. But second is just on local circumstance, right? They argued that, we want to be able to consider local circumstance. First, I'm just unsure what the hell this outcome actually looks like. What does actually considering local circumstance in the process of education actually look like? But second is, I'm just unsure why we can't also co-opt this. As I've explained just now, these councils of educators at the federal level probably also understand how these individuals work on the ground. The political incentives will obviously be that they want to maintain their dominance as the incumbent. But even if we have to trade this off, why be okay? Why does the local circumstance consideration flip the debate? The thesis of this argument is that first, things become a lot more unequal. The quality of education across the board, across Malaysia, across the country becomes a lot worse because some states will care, other states won't because they're deeply, deeply religious. But second, that you lock out a lot of people from actually self-actualizing. When you generalize this education, you're forced to moderate and you're forced to appeal to the mass amount of people. That's probably going to allow individuals to not only just actually respect each other when you engage in these other people from other states, but moreover, just understand yourself and understand other values which people care about. First, that there's obviously a political incentive to literally influence the education system, the point in which this happens. What does this look like? Like obviously red states, obviously states in Malaysia which are hyper-conservative will then just push their own narratives. The structural analysis here is obviously if you have your state authority that you can hold account to and force them to implement policies which reflect your own values, you will obviously do that. So the church belt will literally go to hell. Kelantan will literally go to hell. Every state in Malaysia, like most of the religious states in Malaysia, will literally go to hell because they literally have control over their state authorities and they can force them into those positions. So even if their case works, it probably flips. What's the comparative? You're obviously just going to be doing this on the average individual, which was an argument they tried to say it was a bad outcome, but they just never framed up. 3 reasons why this is good. First, that you just get better quality education for a more diverse pool of individuals. You're obviously going to have it at the moderate level, which means you're allowing these individuals to become centrist. It's good that kids are centrist because you allow them to not only access discourse from the right, but also as the left, which is very, very important. The framing is obviously on children. B, that standardization is just way better. The obvious comparative is that you have a lot of state authorities that really do care and they're rich as hell, so they can push this inequality. On this side of the world, we probably have it at some standard level. But C, that parity gets a lot worse. Like we explained that because of this disproportionality, that a lot of the children who will end up coming out of these states will not only never realize the fact that they're gay because they were born in a red state which never implemented this into the education system, or a state where they were a black individual who was never be able to recognize that they did have rights. They would leave this place and they would never be able to get into the workplace because you have a lot of other more moderate states who are able to lock all of these individuals out. Our case is certain. There's a very, very clear path to victory. The burden to win on site closing government and or just gov in extension here is really high.
Thank you, previous speaker, for the speech. Now to close opening half, calling on the volunteer care, please.
I'll first address two extraneous responses. First, OG says there'll be less funding directed towards education systems in these rural areas or in religious states. This literally knifes Atifa's argument, which is that funding is entirely symmetric. Right. Funding will obviously be directed towards the same thing on a local, on a state incentive and on a federal incentive. Have you ever heard of earmarked funding that has to be directed towards specific things? Second, they say in religious states, now the education system would be insane. They would like teach only religious and anti-LGBTQ things. The issue is though, firstly, people obviously still have constitutional protections in these religious states. They probably will still not be subject to the kind of brainwashing and degradation that they paint to be the likely scenario. Second, and this flips the argument, on their side, people in these states distrust the federal government that is secular and viewed as committing violations against their religion. Therefore, as a response to this, they don't send their children to the traditional educational system that the state sets up. They send their children to alternative religious systems like madrasas, which is far worse because these systems are not accountable. They're a parallel system of education that exists within these religious states because parents and children distrust the school. That suggests there's no federal oversight on their side of the house, which is significantly worse. At least on our side, yes, you teach some version of Islamic ideology in religious states, for instance, but that is moderated by the other forms of curricula that you actually teach because you're still somewhat governed by the local authority. On their side, there is no governance by the local authority. I'm going to talk about three clashes in the speech. First on politics, second on capacity, third on teacher shortage. The first two clashes will take out the claims you get from opening government. The final clash will solidify our path to victory. First, on politics. Their insane claim here is to say federal politics is more of politics than state politics. Federal politics is less political than state politics. This is insane. There's no reason why this is true. There are two responses to their claim that education is more politicized on our side. First is that the motion gives us the capacity to assume under our model we have local boards and local schools that do this rather than a local government. If these institutions don't exist right now, we can set them up, we can fund them as a federal agency for the first few years and give them guidelines as to how to operate, then we can set them free. Second, even if you believe we uniquely have to be controlled by a government or they can be controlled by a board, know that the board is equally likely to be politicized because guess who controls the board? The incumbent government. Even if the board claims to be independent, the government can change the rules that determine that the board is independent. This is why people like Betty DeVos run the educational board in the US in spite of being entirely incompetent. This is why parties often weaponize their political agenda in the process of appointing a person that leads the Board of Education or processing the members that make up the Ministry of Education. This is why Ron DeSantis is claiming things like banning rights, banning queer thought on a federal level. Note that education is easily politicized on both sides, if that is their claim, because protecting our children is a very sensational political narrative that's often weaponized by politicians. Note that given politicization occurs on both sides, the politicization that they do on a federal level is far worse for three reasons. First, because as opposed to their claim, the local state actually usually has similar or longer electoral cycles. The reason is very simple. In the US, you have red states and blue states. Local preferences are far more stable than national preferences because you're not reliant on the arbitrary pendulum of swing states, which means many local states have safe seats. In these safe seats, parties and politicians have long-term incentives, whereas the national government is always being threatened, so they always need to push for the short-term populist policies that Ojin talks about. The second reason why politicization is worse on their side is because on their side, the federal political interest doesn't align with the 49% of the population. You would be a blue state, but your education is controlled by the Trump administration. That is obviously terrible for you because that doesn't align with your preferences. On our side, your preference is far more likely to be in alignment with the local government, and they care more about your preference because you literally voted them into office. You are their core voter base. You might not be the core voter base of the federal administration. The third reason is just that there's more competition on a state level because states compete with each other to have a better economy, to attract more immigration, to attract more investment. The nation doesn't really compete with other nations. There is no international election. This explains that politicization is far worse on their side. Second clash, on expertise. We would just note, we have far more expertise for 5 reasons. Number 1, expertise is suited to a local context. So yes, they have a better claim as to what is best for an average school, what exams and training should be set up for an average teacher. What we tell you is we have far better access to who is best for my school, who is best for the school in this particular region with special needs. No, thank you. Second, they have far less burden because yes, you have 100 people on your side, but you have to take control of the recruitment and training of all of the teachers in the country. So clearly on our side, each person has fewer teachers to train or hire, which means there's lower burden. Third, this task is not that hard, right? You just pick a bar, pick an exam, hire some experts, and filter for the teachers with relatively good CVs. This is not a job you need a genius to do. Fourth, you're more able to adapt on a local level because local bureaucracies are less entrenched. There are less well-established systems, which precisely means they're more mobile. When children's attention spans are decreasing, we take that into account more easily without the various layers of bureaucracy that exist on our side. The final thing to note here on capacity is that you can still hire experts, but uniquely on our side, these experts work on specific local problems. They figure out which is the best teacher and best training process for your school and your state, rather than the best state overall. So for all of these reasons, we actually have far better capacity. Before I explain why teacher shortage is a winning issue for opening opposition, closing.
Teachers usually have like specific programs and teach in nuanced ways and come from the rural communities themselves. They're taught universally to like have universal skills, but not what they'll teach and how they'll teach it.
Yeah, so like the local teaching and training stuff is basically a concession to our side. We want more of that, you want less of that, so you can't defend that. The problem with teacher shortages is the bar is currently too high. Lots of people could be teachers. They are patient. They know high school maths and English relatively well. Why do they not become teachers right now? First, because there is a high bar, as Daisy explained to you, through various structural reasons. Urban parents and urban schools push for a higher bar, and also you have to pick a national average bar rather than a low bar that is probably better for rural areas, because there are fewer individuals from rural areas that are qualified enough to be teachers according to a national standard. Second, even if the bar is technically not super low, you're now faced with a national pool of competition, which means being a teacher is far more scary. You're concerned you won't pass the exam because the Oxford graduate coming back to my country is also participating in these exams. This means far fewer people, and particularly from rural areas that don't have the top quality education that they expect teachers to have, get into the educational system on our side. Empirically, it is just true that many governments enforce requirements, like to be a middle school teacher, you need an undergrad degree, or to be a high school teacher, you need a master's degree. These are completely unnecessary if you actually have the good training skills that we tell you about on our side of the house to actually teach children. The response from closing government is governments incentivize teachers to go to rural areas. First, even if they go to rural areas, it's temporary. These teachers still come from elite institutions. They will not append their route and abandon their families to go to rural areas, and they also feel like this is below them because they've gone past national level training. They're aiming for the national level schools. The impact of this is tremendous. We don't want rural schools to shut down. We don't want their children to be neglected and receive zero education. This is the biggest impact you should believe in this debate.
Okay, previous speaker for that speech. Now the open closing half calling on members here.
Everyone in this debate starts off with very big claims. They claim that immediately at the point in time where you have the controlled model, it will lead to politicization. It will lead to these things being taken over. I think from closing government, what we want to do is just be far more reasonable and thus take out all of the teams in this way. The first thing that I want to discuss is as to why it was unstrategic for the opening half to say that the state was either going to be good or bad. We think that this allows our argument to exist outside the opening deadlock on this matter. What we're able to focus on is just the process. From OG, what they get is just assertions on the fact that standardization just means that the state has more incentive and capacity to ensure that education is of higher quality. There are two reasons why the opening half was largely unstrategic. The first was that on either side, it is likely that the state has a lot of control on the curriculum. The difference based on the info side, which clearly none of these people read, was that the difference was on control in regards to, for example, 1, setting qualifications as to what exactly teachers to meet, 2, on whether or not they would be able to reach out to more teachers, and 3, on the continued development of these teachers. Note that there is nothing in the info side that said that the state had less ability to impose conservative dogma. We think this is something that is then symmetric. This takes out a lot of opposition argument then on the state being bad conservative. What we're able to prove is 1, the fact that it was symmetric again, but secondly, we need it specifically to ensure that we have basic quality on our side. Given that curriculums will be the same in regards to this, we think that if there is any differences, customization is still going to be possible in government. What we ensure is just oversight over which teachers are teaching the customized curriculums that are going to exist
on either side. But secondly, even if we do assume that the state might be bad to a certain degree, what we're able to point out is just that the state has the most resources, which means that we're able to get better education. And what we're going to point out in our extension is on the fact that we just better educators whatsoever, which is the prerequisite for any messages to be communicated towards children who are learning anything. But secondly, we think that there's also a larger argument to be made on the fact that education is ultimately for state purposes. If the state is then bad, what we're able to prove is that we ensure students are better for the workplace, that they're ready, and thus we ensure better outcomes, at least on their individual outcomes at the end of the day. Before I go on to the extension, I then want to take out a lot of opposition material, especially in regards to getting more opt-in, given that I already discussed as to why their politicization argument is already out. We think at the point in time where they discuss that there are going to be too few teachers in rural areas and they try to fix this problem, we already solved this in two ways. That firstly, if the state is the only actor controlling a lot of the concerns that already exist, we think that this means the state inherently has an incentive to fix these things. And we think that this incentive exists not just because of altruistic reasons, just state obligation, but also for reasons just the fact that external accountability is going to impose on them. You can't point out to a lot of individual actors who have fault. You can only point to the state, and which means that at the point where, for example, education is bad, there's likely to be protests. There's likely to be people rising up and saying that this is something that's wrong. But secondly, we think that centralization also means that the government then has an ability to ensure equity, not necessarily equality. So for example, if there is a difference between the rural or urban divide, what we're able to point out is that we're able to just improve the situations of these people. We don't think it's necessarily going to be the case, right, where there's our urban teachers who are being forced to move to rural areas, but rather the government is going to be smart in this way. For example, in Singapore, the National Institute of Education issues scholarships, which ensure that at the point in time where there is a bond that ensures their education is free for a couple of years, that education extends into the provinces to help people for an amount of time because of the benefit that is possible towards teachers. We think that this means that a lot of their arguments on resentment is already taken out. We fix the problem without introducing any cost. We're able to just ensure that these are people who are better off at the end of the day. So what I'm able to prove already, just from our being able to delineate and just from being able to extend, is just that we solve a lot of the more urgent problems that are going to exist. What is the extension then? I'll take that later. Why does the controlled model lead to better education through the hiring and training of better educators to begin with? We think that this is the prerequisite for the opening for education in general to just result in any benefit whatsoever. We first need to ensure that teachers have a basic ability to communicate lessons properly to students, which is something that you get more when the state is able to look out for this rather than lowering barriers, lowering the barrier of entry. We think that creates this problem of opt-in, right? Firstly, I think we were able to respond to this. People still opt-in, likely far more in government because of the ways that the state has a lot of resources to devote to, for example, scholarships. On their side, they want to prove this problem is solved by individual incentive. We don't think that's enough to fix it wide scale. But secondly, even if opt-in does happen in opposition, I don't think they prove by the most basic standard of them being able to ensure that, for example, they actually teach their students to read is going to end up helping. They just say the extent to this is, it's going to be more targeted. Yes, this might be true, but if in any sort of model, but we think that at the point in time where this individual might end up leading to, for example, people with less background in education, this means that students won't understand. What is the problem then overall with the flexible model? We think at the point in time where it's up to individual authorities and schools, which the government always assumes is good, there's four issues. The first is just the fact that there's more inequality across the spectrum between private and public actors. Because private actors have an ability to offer higher compensation towards teachers rather than ensuring that there's a fixed rate across the board, we think that introduces the problem of there being vultures of just taking the best teachers. Public schools are always left out. The second is just that there's a lower barrier to attract teachers to begin with. Given the fact that they want to lower barriers to attract people rather than actually fixing the problem of giving teachers better education, being able to give those resources, we think that this means that there's a race to the bottom where quality just gets lower and lower every time in order to at least ensure that the slot is filled without ensuring that the mind itself is filled. Thirdly, we think that there's no access to promote recruitment quite as much. So even if, for example, they are able to recruit, they only recruit within that limited area, which means that you just get far worse teachers rather than assuming that you get the best minds from the capital. But fourthly, we think that once people are heard, they aren't able to ensure continued learning. On our side, because the state does things such as, for example, continued education programs, this ensures that teachers are updated on the latest lessons. This is something that is solely proven on our side of the house. Before I go on to why this is fixed, PY from opening.
You don't control the salaries of teachers, as you point out, but you do control the bar for hiring teachers. We lower the bar in rural areas and obviously get more teachers.
You don't lower the bar in rural areas, or rather you do, but that doesn't mean that you're able to heighten the barrier of what teachers you end up attracting. What we're able to prove is that on your side, when you lower the barrier, you ensure the teachers who aren't ready to actually teach are there, which means if a slot is filled, you don't actually ensure that there are better outcomes for students in these rural areas. It's more likely to lead to stagnation because the problem appears to be fixed. Why do we end up being fixed on our side with centralization. Why this capacity exists. The first is what we're able to explain on equity and not equality. We're able to just shift resources across the board. We think that this happens insofar as we're able to just ensure that the state has a lot of incentive insofar as it's the biggest actor. So we think this happens in a couple of ways. That firstly, there's just a lot of resource pooling through taxes. Individuals are able to contribute to the state, which means that they have some money which is allocated within the budget, and this is going to get cheaper because of economies of scale. But secondly, we think actors, for example, partnerships with private actors still exist, which means that they're able to ensure that that capacity goes in. The second reason then for why we're able to fix it better on our side is the basic standard that we talk about. Thirdly, the fact that the state knows what is most needed at the end of the day. But fourthly, we just solve a lot of problems that exist in the long term. If you want to believe that we're able to get better teachers, that's something we do on-side government.
The thank the previous speaker for his touched upon a number of factors.
All good? Okay. Opening opposition's case is incredibly nebulous because what it assumes is that the central government will be very, very bad to the point where they will not supply any teachers to these rural areas even when these people are underqualified. So maybe it is the case that opening opposition's case ends up proving that there is an increased access barrier for people locally to opt into the teaching profession, but that does not automatically mean that the central government does not send people in the interim to ensure that there is some teaching, in which case what we will do from closing opposition is explain first what are the sorts of teachers that the central government ends up sending and hence as a replacement for locally available teachers, and hence being far more comparative towards government teams as opposed to opening opposition uncharitably framing that there will be less teachers as a whole. And then secondly, we would explain why this leads to much more student enrollment and not just about teaching profession, because the biggest problem that rural areas face is not just about people pursuing teaching but also about people not sending their kids to rural areas, which we think is a problem that government bench exacerbates significantly. The second observation I want to make about opening opposition is that their impacting is also incredibly nebulous, because at best it says that the sort of education that you would want to for your kids to learn is education which is context specific of that specific region, but this response is far more vulnerable to government teams saying that maybe it might be context specific, but that does not mean that it is economically viable for you if it's the case that it can't even get to an entry-level job. We from closing opposition will specifically explain who are the sorts of teachers and hence what are the things they teach you, which also means that you become more economically viable in these rural areas. Let's first explain what the comparative in this debate is. The framing of this argument is very simple. We think on their side, on government bench, what tends to happen is when you require, when you have to educate these areas, central governments end up hiring teachers like from urban areas and send them to rural areas on a contract basis of 3 to 4 years, which is not a permanent job because that is the only meaningful way in which they can replace the locally available teachers. This is true for 3 specific reasons. The first is that local uneducated people would require a lot of time and money to get qualified, which means that central governments do somewhat care, but the only reasonable way in which they would make sure that the gap gets filled is by, or at least for the time lag for 3 to 4 years, is by making sure that they end up sending those people from urban areas who are already quite educated. But more importantly, we think that on a balance of probabilities, if you believe that urban areas have a higher number of educated teachers, then that also means that the pool of teachers that you have to pick from has a bigger composition from urban areas as opposed to rural areas. So if national governments have a national educational agenda, then they would end up sending probably a bigger number of urban teachers to these rural areas, because that is the only meaningful way in which you can align your national policy. In which case, we think that the sorts of teachers that you end up sending might not be from those areas, and hence we think that creates problems, which I will talk about later. The third thing I would note is the fact that even if you are locally present, the problem is that for you to acquire academic qualifications, you would presumably have to go to an urban area and acquire those, because if you have to go to, say, for example, Ateneo de Manila in the Philippines, or if you have to go to Taylor, say, in Kuala Lumpur, that only happens, those are the sorts of restrictions that these governments end up setting, in which case maybe you were born rurally, but if the time lag exists for 4 to 5 years, and then if you want to come back, presumably you would not be locally connected to your roots significantly, but also the fact that people would not have seen you in those areas in the first place, which means that there's a massive disconnect that exists at the point at which the sorts of teachers that central governments end up hiring exist, as opposed to on our side where we lower the barrier of entry. Before I move on to why this increases student enrollment, which is the crux of our case, OG shoot.
Yeah, we've already recognized how teacher selection process becomes biased to local state interests and rhetoric, exacerbating existing discriminatory conditions.
Okay, this has
Against your-
This has no margin at all, because the problem is that central governments can be equally discriminatory. Closing opposition's case does not bank upon a specific characterization of a central government being good or bad or a local government being good or bad, but something far more structurable and and not context specific to any specific government. Let's explain why academic enrollment increases significantly. There are 3 reasons for this. The first is that the reason why parents are not sending their children to school currently, or at least on their side of the house, is because the sorts of teachers that are hired are not relatable to these parents. Which is to say that if parents do not see the people they see every day teaching in these schools, and if they think that urbanized teachers are the people that are teaching in these institutions, then it creates a massive lack of relatability, and these parents distrust these urbanized teachers to equip their kids with the actual meaningful education. So that a meaningful example of this is that in rural areas, we think that LGBTQI plus education is often not supported by parents, but the perception they have about this urbanized teachers is that they might enforce their ideologies on these on their kids, and that is why they don't even want to send their kids to school in the first place. And this is where we think that parents think that there's a massive opportunity cost that their kids have if sent to school in the first place, in which case we think that if there are locally available teachers, it's far more likely that parents send their children to school because the local trust is significantly more. So it is not about these kids or these teachers having the knowledge of context, but the perception that parents have that these people have knowledge of the context as opposed to the urbanized teachers. The second thing I would note is the fact that if it is the case that the governments at the state are significantly politically different from governments at the center, we think that local governments already push very populist agendas or popular agendas and are skeptical of the process of hiring that central governments opt into. Which is to say that if the context that the central government operates in is different from the context that local governments operate in, then we think that it is politically popular internally for the local government to convince its own people that this system of education is not meaningful for you, and this introduces bad competition because local governments weaponize the narrative that the central government is sending their people to you and you should not opt into these schools. Maybe you think that this is worst casey, but it is not. It happens literally in every rural area because it is the lowest hanging fruit of a narrative that the vast amount of local parties opt into. What this means is that the perception of parents is also influenced by these notions because local governments make them believe that urbanized teachers are not good for you. On our side of the house, at the point at which you hire local teachers, presumably that the perverse notion for local governments goes away because there is no central enforcement, and it is much harder for local governments to scapegoat the central government for sending in bad teachers. The final thing I would note about this argument is that the cost on their side also don't scale up, because the problem is that if you have to hire people on a contract basis, then maybe after 3 to 4 years you have to hire another teacher, in which case the amount of money that you have to give is also increases much more. On our side of the house, at the point at which you hire one teacher, we think that it is much more likely that this person stays in the local area for a significant amount of time, presumably because you have reduced the access barrier for them, but also the fact that this educational system can become sustainable for itself. Which is to say that if you are a person who was educated through the system, then presumably after 12 years, once you have passed school, you can be the same person who gives back to the community via the same mechanism that we talk about. So our impact does not just scale up on the current students, but also on potential future students who can be educated by the people who are students currently. What this means for the debate is 3 things. Number 1, we increase access to a bigger number of people, not because we are increasing financial access, which is what top half wants the debate to be, but we reduce the skepticism that parents have to send their children to school. The response from Gov then would be, oh bro, but parents also want their kids to be lifted out of poverty. Maybe that is the case, but the primary motivation at that time is that urbanized teachers might not be the instruments for their kids to be uplifted from poverty, which only exists on our side once there is trust, which is where we explain that trust is the precursor for children to be sent to school. But secondly, we also think that it equalizes internal disparities not just between the people who are marginalized in these areas versus the elite people, but also between different regions, which is the best thing for the debate. Okay, ready? I
think the other teams are doing too much, right? The first thing I want to do is position and further analyze the extension we were given. Because OG, firstly, is quite assertive to argue that every local body is both short-termist and evil, right? Because OO correctly points out that there are central regulations to this, like the Constitution, and CO says that states can plan this ahead, like even if they're local. These are both reasonable. So how do we enter given these like concerns from OG? We say that the actual tipping point is in accountability. Because I just want to prove why it's way less accountable in opposition. Because you have to realize the sheer amount of states that exist in every single given country. What this means is that one, it is way easier to suppress protests against bad educations locally through things like just hiring goons because there's less media attention on this, like a less number of journalists on this. But secondly, it is way easier to get away with corrupted funds because a lot of the other funds that you're like bringing out to people are decentralized and more relaxed within these areas. Because take note, like the info side is very important here. A relaxed approach means that you assume the autonomy and not just the things that they teach, but the ways in which they use their budget. So it's very easy for the central government to like push off responsibility and fully trust the things that the documents and the receipts that local governments give them back, meaning it is more corruptible. So accountability is way hard. On the flip side, it's easier. Accountability towards a central state is easier simply because everyone is affected by this central system. So if it is bad, people will rally against this and organize against this and want to have like parties, progressive parties will want to take over by politicizing this problem. And this is very effective because education is very highly valued, especially in places like Asia. Secondly, OG has a problem of which framing of state intention to go for. They need governments to have good incentives that aren't just reactions to pushback, right? What we say is that oversight is good, even if the state might be bad in some instances, because states are quite huge. They're not just evil or not evil. Like, I'm non-binary, the state is non-binary, right? What this means is that more resources are just meaning that you're able to pull through with educating kids in the first place and having them stay in school. Because you teach people rigidly on things like engaging with the kids in the first place, communicating well, and being in line with scientific pedagogies and processes of education in the first place, which is something that opposition never is able to prove in the first place. They don't make the logical connection between relaxing things and things somewhat being more scientific because of all of the counter incentives that GovBench pushed. What this means then is that you are probably like going to be more in line with a central body to this because of things like you just have more scientists, you have more teachers for this. Next, I'm going to weigh out a lot of the politicking material. O says that local politics are still deeply political. Exactly, but we engage with it better, right? We flip it because it is easier to hold this central authority accountable given that on either side there's equal proportion, like equal possibility for politicking to be really bad. Because regardless of how much politics does, you can't compare the likelihood of this. So you ought to defer to what Miranda explained. Because it is symmetric, you need to attain basic quality first. And this is good because basic quality is higher, more better attained because you have a lot of these resources. Meaning that if the state messes up, they have resources to improve this system continuously on the long term. Something that they didn't prove that they have. Let's talk about CO. The first thing they say is that they teach badly because they go to rural areas and they're like urban elites. This is really stupid. Honestly, I'm sorry. This is the logic of this is not necessarily proven because a lot of teachers generally in urban areas are not the most privileged of people to begin with, or maybe they moved from these rural areas. Or by the way, there are tons of teachers that come from rural areas and go back to teach in these rural areas in the first place, meaning that they're trained to learn a lot of the local context in the first place, and there are pedagogical there are educational processes to how this happens. Example, there's a theory in my program which is that you have to be for the people and from the people, which is to say you listen to what the communities want and teach them, because the rigorous training never teaches you what to teach, it teaches you how to teach, which by the way is extremely scientific, extremely universal, because kids generally have the same psychology because they have the same brains. But there's also an incentive to be trained well because governments want more people in higher education in the first place to even attain teachers. And by the way, if there's an acute teacher shortage, which is the harm they're pushing on us, states will not want this to happen at all, meaning that they will likely incentivize more teachers to stay in these rural areas because it's more expensive and teachers can just leave. But I want to push on the relatability. It's pretty crazy because it assumes that there are no rural teachers whatsoever, and all of my responses deal with this, and relatability is not that big of a thing. Next thing they say is that parents would hate them. No. One, parents romanticize professionals from the capital, so that's one flip. But also, why is it seen as an imposition? They don't really prove it. But parents also like rigid programs, but if they try to push the harm that people will pull out, it's literally mandatory story, and there's a high threshold to literally pull your child out of school and stop them from learning basic math. Clearly, their harm is very speculative. But on our worst case, I want to frame this out. The urban majority are very important as well. It is worsened on their side because the standards are up to each individual school, and it is prone to a lot of things like employment bias. The majority here is also the most economically productive, so it trickles down to the rural states even at worst, so we weigh them out. Let's talk about OO. One, everything they say is premised on the program being more expensive. This is a public program, right? I don't understand why teachers would pay for it. They don't structurally prove it, and people don't pay to join the military, for example, right? But I want to explain three proper responses. One, teachers aren't rich, so the state will subsidize to get teachers. Two, less teachers means less skilled workers to contribute to the economy, so the state wouldn't want to make this super costly. Third, this would create insane pushback if you make it so expensive for teachers, so it's not costly. But even if they have to pay, usually high-paying jobs are what states create in the first place so people opt in. For example, state doctors, even if it's expensive. This means it's a worthy trade-off even if there are less net teachers, because the problem now is that teachers come and go. We'd rather have teachers stay and be extremely professional. But secondly, to believe their impacts, you need to believe that teachers won't go to rural areas. They say it's not worth it in their eyes. This assumes teachers are cold and calculating and only care about money. One, teachers can come from rural areas, and that means they have a deep sense of obligation. But secondly, teachers have different backgrounds, and many of them deal with rural conditions like agriculture and rural business. Yes, Ricky?
In rural religious states, we proved that fewer rural and long-term teachers will exist due to the federal bar on their side being higher, which CO derives all of their impacts from. It doesn't matter if states fund schools more, there are fewer teachers that cater to their children.
Teachers have abilities. Just because a bar is high doesn't mean a rural teacher is not going to opt into that, or is completely impossible for them to do anything. But Ricky tries to push back by explaining that people distrust schools. It's not exclusive. People can hate their own local government. But next, they say more competition between states. This is something that is bad. They say it's good, this is bad. Because you have dubious methods to compete with other states by framing things like other states being inferior, by fanning things like ethnic tensions, because you're trying to compete and get more people to stick within your own educational system. This is terribly bad if you give them the autonomy to be extremely racially biased. But lastly, they say local processes provide more nuance. This assumes relaxed models are even implemented in the first place properly according to what they say is going to be the plan. It won't be, because of things like private capture, because of things like different competing interests per individual schools. But also, they try to dog on teachers. Teachers are nuanced in how they apply skills and are very similar to doctors. You teach doctors in a centralized way, but they can become rural doctors. All of this is to say, just buy the more intuitive, by closing opposition. I understand these guys are good, but we have the logic. Thank you.
Thanks for the speaker for the speech. Now the end of it calling on opposition. Your turn.
CG says they have logic, but they don't have context, and they assume that states have infinite capacity to, one, subsidize your education, subsidize your multiple degrees that you have to do for getting a bachelor's in education, then getting a master's in education, and you know how to become a teacher, but you also are subject matter expert in your subject, but they'll also create jobs for you that they can end up paying you recurringly over month and month, and you'll do this across a developing country in the most rural of places. How does a state have infinite capacity to do this, specifically as a developing nation? Specifically, rural areas are highly deprioritized in the national budget itself. I'm really unsure why you go ahead and do those things on closing government, which means that at some point the teacher will have to invest something. If not maybe for education, they'll have to go ahead and go to an urban center to get to that college, right? Because the colleges are not in rural places. So you have to still spend on things like living standards. You have to pay the rent of your house till you're learning for those 3, 4, 5 years when you're learning how to go ahead and become a teacher. Which means you will incur significant costs as a person who's trying to upskill themselves and learn under a state program anyway. But what does this mean? This means for GovCase to operate, they have to explain to us why a teacher on their side of the house has any incentive to come back to rural places where the salaries that you collect as a rural school are so little that you can't go and fund these people for long term. Which means they'll go for private education, they'll go for private schools, more on side government because they've invested so much. On our side of the house, you don't have this high requirement, which means these are people who are not actually educators. These are people who looks like your local farmer leader. It looks like you people who's a local policeman. It looks like people who do things like research and probably earn from these research is you can look like your businessman going ahead and teaching maths because he knows maths and he knows accounting. So those kind of things can exist on our side of the house because you can supplement the income that you don't get from teaching from other methods because the quality standards are not as strict, which means on our side of the house we enable more access. I want to deal with closing government first directly. The closing government says that accountability is much more because you call out a central government teacher much more. I want to talk about accountability on two fronts. Accountability matters, one, when you have the capacity to go ahead and call this person out vis-a-vis their own capacity as the person that you're calling out, but secondly it also depends on the other person's and how much they care about you to concede to your demands, right? On the first idea, I think of like 5 villages in India, if they have an issue like with a particular set of teachers that they are currently teaching, it's easy to call them out when they are from the local authorities or like when the local government is going and doing this, right? Because a state government, a smaller city government or the city council, they're caring about those 5 villages much more than a central government for whom you're just a drop in the bucket, right? Because you're not the electorate they're going for in the first place anyway. You're very small in number, so it's impossible for them to go ahead and actually hold them accountable. But secondly, the central governments have infinitely more legal resources to fight those court cases, even if you file like something like a class action lawsuit. The problem is on closing government, the capacity, the disparity between a local school and a local like people who go ahead and protesting against this versus like a state is something that's still matchable, but with the central government it's impossible to match it, which means that you can hold these people much more accountable. But secondly, like I explained earlier, the local city councils have more incentive to listen to you and concede your demands because they are more relatable to you, because these people know you. You are like literally your farmer leaders know all the farmers in a particular area. But what happens on their side? The prime minister of the country doesn't know these 5 villages even exist, which means that it's impossible for them to go and concede and care about you, which means accountability doesn't really happen. Accountability gets effectively flipped. Secondly, they say that okay, I'll take you short.
In a controlled system, funding comes from the state with billions of taxes. In a relaxed system, you are self-funded, and that's where your problems actually get.
This also, I'll respond to this, and this also beats out opening government because I think they assume that states have so much capacity that they do anything well. If states have capacity and states have obligation and responsibility and they care about the voting that these people give you, then states on our side of the house as well have incentive to share expertise with local city councils. I'm not sure why states are the only one who can make policy. I think states can make those policies, give suggestions to local governments, and local governments can use this information alongside their own local knowledge and make a better policy which factors in both the best of both worlds, right? That can only uniquely happen because states also have incentive, or central governments also have incentive to share information with local governments. I don't think it's a clear binary that side opening government and closing government are in the case on. Let's figure out opening government then. Opening government says that you get better quality research because the same idea, right? That you get more information. But I think it's very easy for us to explain that there is incentive for central authorities to share information with state authorities, like we explained earlier, because they also want to get this central authority on board. They don't want a rebellious village or a rebellious state as a whole, right? So they want them to align with their own incentives, which means they have incentive to share the expertise. They'll not go ahead and cut them out completely. But secondly, I think the reason why I win over opening opposition is also quite clear, because opening opposition tells you that you have local context. But the problem is they don't explain why this knowledge of local context is something that's going to create a tipping point for people to opt into education. This is not about the opt-in by teachers. This is opt-in by students, which is a logically prior clash to education as a whole existing. You can have the best teachers, you can have the best educators, the most trained professionals, but if the farmer is not willing to send his child to school, then there's no point to have this. Note, as a farmer, you have two choices. One, you send your 10-year-old child to work on the field or rather incur that opportunity cost of having one less person on the field and send a child to school to probably learn maths, which he'll use like 14 years later and get a job. That opportunity cost is a massive cost that most people do not want to incur in rural places because they don't see the long-term possible benefit of this. They want to care about short-term things. So when it's about more relatable teachers who go ahead and teach in their local context, like if your farmer leader is teaching a class, he can tell you that this is the physics subject, but this is how you apply this in the particular context that your family lives in. He knows your father, he knows your mother. That relatability is something that's massively important because this also breeds accountability in terms of things like parent-teacher meetings. But it also looks like you telling them how to effectively use the education that you're using in things like vocational training onwards. All those things can only happen when local contexts are better known. This is why opening opposition, when they never explain the tipping point of why this creates an opt-in by people to go ahead and actually start the education process in the first place. This is what we uniquely unlock. What do we also say on closing opposition? One, we explained to you that most central government jobs are run on a rotation basis. Yeah. What this means is that these are temporary jobs. So either people have to go from urban areas to go ahead and teach in rural areas, or rural people go to urban centers, learn, and then probably come back. Yeah. But you still are on a rotation with the central government's contract because you are not controlled by local authority. So they can shift you from this particular village to that particular village. It is doesn't matter if there's an urban-rural divide. The idea is that if someone from the north of India goes to south of India, the context has changed so much, right? The kind of farming systems change so much. What do you learn about these things changes so much that you can't effectively teach in those places. So if you go and keep this rotation ongoing, the people do not have the continuity of education. That is also important because that means that sustained opt-in only happens on our side of the house when the same person keeps on teaching in this place on our side. This person can supplement their income by not getting a lot of money from teaching because rural places don't have a lot of money, like I explained, in tuition fees, or they can't build a lot of salaries or salary pool. So what do? You can have people who run things like businesses to go and teach. That continuity of operational continuity of education ensures that the opt-in is not only just existent on our side, it is also sustained for a longer duration. Without this clash, neither team in this debate can actually win this debate because they just explain education quality is important. Then explained by people access to education equality. Without that access, the debate is moved. For all those reasons, closing competition.
Thank you, Mr. President. Take all your leaders for your across the house.